The dirt beneath Grace Donovan's knees was still fresh and soft, and her tears fell like summer rain onto the wooden marker that bore her mother's name. It was late August in 1878, and the cemetery outside Belmont, Colorado, sat quiet under a sky beginning to purple with twilight. Grace had been there since noon, when they lowered her mother into the ground, when the preacher said his words, and the townspeople offered their sympathies before drifting away like dandelion seeds on the wind. Now she was alone, or so she thought, her fingers clutching the black fabric of her mourning dress as sobs tore through her chest with a violence that left her breathless. Sarah Donovan had been only 42 years old when the fever took her. 3 days of burning skin and rattling breaths, and then she was gone, leaving Grace at 21 years old without a single blood relative in the world. Her father had died in a mining accident when she was 12, and her brother Thomas had been killed 2 years ago in a saloon shooting over a card game gone wrong. Now her mother, the last thread connecting her to family, to belonging, to the sense that she mattered to someone in this harsh and unforgiving world, was buried beneath 6 feet of Colorado soil. The sun continued its descent, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, but Grace barely noticed. She wept until her throat was raw, until her eyes burned, until she thought there could not possibly be any tears left inside her body. And still they came, wave after wave of grief so profound it felt like drowning. She did not hear the footsteps approaching through the grass. She did not see the tall figure that paused at the cemetery gate, hesitated, then walked slowly toward her. It was only when a shadow fell across her mother's grave that Grace looked up, startled, her vision blurred with tears. A man stood there, hat in his hands, his face weathered and kind. He was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore the dusty clothes of a working cowboy, leather chaps over denim, a faded blue shirt, boots that had seen 1,000 miles. He did not speak, did not offer empty platitudes or false comfort. He simply stood there, a quiet presence in her ocean of grief. "I do not mean to intrude," he said finally, his voice low and rough like gravel underfoot. "I can leave if you prefer." Grace wiped at her face with trembling hands, suddenly aware of how she must look, her eyes swollen, her nose red, her carefully pinned hair coming loose from its moorings. "I thought everyone had gone. Most have." He shifted his weight, still holding his hat. "I am Tobias Miller. I work at the Double R Ranch east of town. I knew your mother a little. She was kind to me once when I first came to Belmont. I wanted to pay my respects." Grace nodded, unable to form words. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks and she looked away, embarrassed by her inability to control them. Tobias did not leave. Instead, he moved to stand beside the grave, not too close, giving her space but offering his presence. The sun sank lower, and still he stood there, silent and steady as the mountains themselves. Grace found something strangely comforting in his quiet vigil. He did not try to fill the silence with meaningless words. He did not tell her that time would heal all wounds or that her mother was in a better place. He simply stood, and somehow that was exactly what she needed. As the last light faded and stars began to pierce the darkening sky, Grace finally spoke. She made the best apple pie in 3 counties. "Did you know that?" "I did not," Tobias said softly, "but I do not doubt it." She used to sing while she baked, old songs from when she was a girl in Missouri. She had a beautiful voice. Grace's own voice cracked. "I will never hear it again." "No," Tobias agreed, and she appreciated his honesty. "But you will remember it. Memory is a powerful thing." "Is it enough?" "I do not know. I hope so." The moon rose, nearly full, casting silver light across the cemetery. Grace shivered in the cooling air, and Tobias shrugged out of his vest, stepping forward to drape it across her shoulders. The gesture was simple, practical, but it carried a weight of kindness that made Grace's throat tighten again. "Thank you," she whispered. "You are welcome." More time passed. Grace told him stories about her mother, memories spilling out like water from a broken dam. She told him about learning to sew at her mother's knee, about the time Sarah Donovan had faced down a drunken miner twice her size who was bothering women outside the general store, about how she always kept wildflowers on the kitchen table even in the depths of winter, buying them from the greenhouse at ridiculous expense, because she said a home needed beauty to be bearable. Tobias listened to every word, and occasionally he shared small observations or asked gentle questions that kept Grace talking. She sensed that he understood the need to speak, to turn memories into words before they faded into the silence of loss. "What about you?" Grace asked as midnight approached. "Do you have family?" Tobias was quiet for a long moment. "I had a brother once. He died in the war. My parents passed some years back, cholera. I am sorry, as am I, for your loss." He looked up at the stars. "It is a hard thing to be alone in the world." Yes, Grace felt the truth of it settle over her like a heavy blanket. "The preacher said I should trust in God's plan, but I cannot see what purpose this serves. My mother was good. She deserved more years." "I find that goodness and deserving have little to do with how long we get," Tobias said. "The world is not fair in that way, but perhaps the purpose is not in the losing but in what we do after. How we choose to keep living, keep loving, keep finding reasons to wake up each morning." Grace considered this. "And have you found reasons?" "Some days more than others," he admitted. "But yes, the sunrise, good horses, the smell of rain on dry earth, a well-cooked meal, small things mostly, but they add up to something worth staying for." The honesty in his words touched something deep inside Grace. She had expected platitudes from people, the comfortable lies that the grieving are supposed to accept with grace. But Tobias offered her truth instead, and it felt like a gift. "Will you tell me about your brother?" she asked. And so Tobias talked about James Miller, older by 3 years, who had enlisted in 1863 and died at the Battle of Chickamauga. He spoke of childhood adventures and brotherly mischief, of learning to ride together and dreaming of going west. His voice carried a quiet sadness, but also a warmth of remembrance that made Grace think he had learned to hold both grief and love in his heart at the same time. The night deepened around them. A chill wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains. Grace realized with some surprise that hours had passed, that she had been sitting in a cemetery after dark without fear because this stranger had chosen to stand beside her through it all. "Why did you stay?" she asked suddenly. "You did not know me. You could have paid your respects and left hours ago." Tobias met her eyes in the moonlight. "Because I remember what it was like, those first hours after loss. How the silence feels like it might swallow you whole. How everyone else's lives just continue on while yours has stopped completely." He paused. "I stayed because I thought you might need someone to stand in the silence with you, and I have strong shoulders for bearing quiet." Something shifted in Grace's chest, a small crack in the wall of grief that had enclosed her heart. "That is perhaps the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me." "Then people have not been kind enough to you." Grace almost smiled at that, a tiny quirk of her lips that surprised her. She had not thought she would ever smile again. Yet here in this graveyard, with this gentle cowboy who understood the language of loss, something approaching comfort had found her. As the night wore on toward dawn, Grace found herself growing drowsy despite her grief. Her body was exhausted from crying, from the emotional storm that had battered her for hours. Her head began to droop, and without thinking, she leaned slightly against Tobias's leg where he stood beside her. He did not move away. Instead, he shifted to sit on the ground beside her, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough that his presence was solid and real. "You should go home," he said gently. "Get some rest." "I cannot leave her yet," Grace whispered. "Not yet." "Then we will wait for sunrise," Tobias said simply. "I am in no hurry." So they waited, these two lonely souls in a cemetery under the stars, both mourning losses that could never be recovered, both finding an unexpected solace in shared understanding. Grace talked when she needed to talk, fell silent when words failed her, and Tobias remained constant beside her, a lighthouse in her storm. The eastern sky began to pale as 4 o'clock approached, then 5. The stars faded one by one, and the world held its breath in that liminal space between darkness and day. Birds began their morning songs, and the air grew slightly warmer with the promise of sun. As the first golden rays broke over the mountains, painting the cemetery in soft light, Grace felt something settle inside her. The grief was still there, sharp and terrible, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. There was also gratitude for the years she had been given with her mother. There was appreciation for this unexpected kindness from a stranger. There was a tiny, fragile sense that perhaps she could survive this after all. "The sunrise," she said softly, watching the light spread across her mother's grave. "You said it was one of your reasons for staying." "Yes," Tobias said, and his voice held a note of quiet wonder. "Every sunrise feels like a promise that the world keeps trying, keeps beginning again despite everything." Grace turned to look at him, really look at him in the growing light. His face was lined with weariness, but his eyes were clear and kind. He had given up a night of sleep to stand vigil with a grieving stranger, asking nothing in return, and she realized with sudden clarity that this was a rare sort of person. "Thank you, Tobias Miller," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "I do not know how I will ever repay such kindness." "There is no debt," he assured her. "Kindness is not a loan." They rose stiffly from their long night on the ground, brushing dirt from their clothes. Grace laid one last hand on her mother's grave marker, whispering a private goodbye, and then turned toward the cemetery gate. Her legs were unsteady beneath her, and Tobias offered his arm without a word. She took it gratefully, leaning on his strength as they walked out into the morning. Belmont was beginning to wake. Smoke rose from chimneys as breakfast fires were lit. A rooster crowed somewhere in the distance. The town looked exactly as it had yesterday, unchanged and indifferent to the seismic shift in Grace's world, yet somehow it felt different now. Less hostile, less empty. "Where do you live?" Tobias asked as they reached the main street, above the seamstress shop. "Mrs. Henderson lets me rent the room in exchange for helping with the sewing." Grace gestured toward a tidy building painted pale blue. "I should probably try to sleep, though I do not know if I can." "You should eat something first," Tobias suggested. "The hotel serves breakfast. Let me buy you something, please. You have had nothing since yesterday morning, I would wager." Grace realized he was right. Her stomach felt hollow and strange, and she could not remember her last meal. "I could not impose further on your kindness." "You could, and you will," Tobias said firmly but gently. "Consider it a favor to me. I am too tired to eat alone and too hungry to skip the meal." So Grace found herself sitting in the hotel dining room as the sun climbed higher, eating scrambled eggs and biscuits that tasted like sawdust in her grief-numbed mouth, but drinking strong coffee that helped clear some of the fog from her mind. Tobias ate methodically across from her, and they spoke little, but the silence was comfortable now, familiar after their long night together. Other early risers filtered into the dining room, and Grace saw the curious glances, the whispered speculations about why Grace Donovan was having breakfast with a cowboy from the Double R. Let them talk, she thought wearily. Their gossip seemed trivial and distant, unimportant in the face of real loss. When the meal was finished, Tobias walked her to the seamstress shop. "Will you be all right?" he asked, genuine concern in his eyes. "I honestly do not know," Grace admitted. "But I will keep waking up and keep breathing, and I suppose that is a start. That is all any of us can do." Tobias settled his hat back on his head, preparing to leave. "If you need anything, send word to the Double R. I will come." "Why would you do that for me? We are strangers." "We were strangers," Tobias corrected gently. "Now we are two people who have stood together through the darkest part of the night. That means something." He tipped his hat and turned to go, his boots clicking on the wooden sidewalk, and Grace watched him walk away, feeling as though something significant had shifted in her life, though she was too exhausted and grief-stricken to fully understand what it meant. The days that followed were a blur of gray numbness. Grace went through the motions of living because she had no other choice. She woke, dressed in her black mourning clothes, helped Mrs. Henderson with sewing work, forced herself to eat, and tried to sleep through nights haunted by dreams of her mother. The town moved on around her with bewildering speed, people laughing and conducting business as though the world had not fundamentally changed, and Grace felt like a ghost drifting through a life that no longer made sense. But 3 days after the funeral, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Tobias standing there, hat in hand once again, holding a small wooden box. "I hope I am not disturbing you," he said. "I wanted to bring you something." Grace stepped aside to let him into her modest room. It was small but tidy, with a narrow bed, a washstand, her sewing supplies, and little else. She had never entertained a man here before and felt suddenly self-conscious about the poverty of her circumstances. If Tobias noticed or cared about the sparse furnishings, he gave no sign. Instead, he held out the wooden box. "I am not much for fancy words or grand gestures, but I thought you might like this." Grace took the box and opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in paper, was a small plant in a terracotta pot. It had delicate white flowers and filled the room with a subtle, sweet fragrance. "It is jasmine," Tobias explained. "It does well indoors if you put it by a window. Your mother liked flowers in the house, you said. I thought perhaps you might too." Tears sprang to Grace's eyes, but they were different from the tears she had cried at the graveside. These were softer, touched with warmth as well as sadness. "It is beautiful, thank you." "The flowers come back each year," Tobias added quietly. "Even when you think the plant is done blooming, it surprises you." Grace understood the metaphor he was offering, the gentle suggestion that grief was not the end of everything, that life had a way of returning even after the hardest winters. She set the plant carefully on the windowsill where sunlight streamed through the glass. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. "It is poor hospitality to accept such a gift and offer nothing in return." "I would like that very much." So Tobias sat at her small table while Grace prepared coffee on the room's tiny stove. They talked about simple things at first, the weather and the town news, but gradually their conversation deepened. Tobias told her about his work at the Double R, about breaking horses and mending fences, about sleeping under the stars during the summer roundup. Grace found herself telling him about her sewing, about her dreams of one day opening her own dress shop, about how her mother had encouraged that dream even though it seemed impossibly ambitious for a woman alone with little money. "Why is it impossible?" Tobias asked. "You have the skill. You could save money, rent a proper shop space." It takes more than skill, Grace said. It takes capital for fabric and supplies for rent for a dozen other things, and it takes respectability. Who would patronize a dress shop run by an orphan seamstress with no family standing? Who would not patronize a shop that makes beautiful clothes at fair prices? Tobias countered. I think you underestimate yourself. His confidence in her was startling. They had known each other only a handful of days, yet he spoke as though her success was certain, inevitable even. Grace felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something that had been frozen since her mother's death. Tobias began visiting regularly after that, stopping by her room or finding her at the seamstress shop when his work brought him to town. They fell into an easy friendship, or perhaps something more than friendship, though neither named it yet. He brought her small gifts, always thoughtful, never extravagant. A book of poetry he thought she might enjoy, a pretty stone he found in the creek bed, wild flowers when the jasmine was not blooming. Grace found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that surprised her. She began to notice details about him, the way his eyes crinkled when he almost smiled, how his hands were calloused from hard work but gentle when handling her jasmine plant, the way he listened with his whole attention as though her words were the most important thing in the world. 6 weeks after her mother's funeral, Tobias invited Grace to go riding with him. The aspens are turning gold up in the high country, he said. It is a sight worth seeing, and I think getting out of town might do you good. Grace hesitated. She had been in mourning, barely leaving her room except for work and necessities. But something in Tobias's steady gaze made her want to say yes, to step back into the world of the living even if it felt too soon. I have not ridden in years, she admitted. Not since my father died and we had to sell our horses. I will bring you the gentlest mare in the string, Tobias promised. She is practically a rocking chair with legs. So Grace borrowed a riding skirt from Mrs. Henderson and met Tobias at the edge of town the following Sunday. True to his word, the mare he brought was placid and easy, and Grace found the old skills returning as they set out toward the mountains. The autumn air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and the earthy sweetness of falling leaves. They rode in companionable silence for a time, and Grace felt the tension she had been carrying start to ease from her shoulders. The aspen grove Tobias led her to was breathtaking, thousands of trees blazing gold against the deep blue sky, their leaves shimmering and rustling in the breeze like whispered secrets. They dismounted and walked among the trees, and Grace felt her spirit lift in a way it had not since before her mother took ill. This is incredible, she breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. I thought you might like it. Tobias leaned against a tree trunk, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. You seem lighter today. I feel lighter, Grace admitted. The grief is still there. I think it always will be, but it does not feel quite so crushing as it did. Like maybe I can carry it and still live at the same time. That is exactly how it works, Tobias said softly. The load does not get smaller, but you get stronger at bearing it. Grace moved to stand beside him, looking up through the golden canopy at patches of sky. I do not think I ever properly thanked you, Tobias, for that night at the cemetery, for your visits, for your kindness. You have been a light in a very dark time. You do not need to thank me, he said, but his voice was rough with emotion. I did not do it expecting gratitude. Why did you do it then? Tobias was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words came slowly, carefully chosen. At first, it was just about not leaving someone alone in their pain. But then I started visiting, and I told myself it was to check on you to make sure you were managing. But the truth is, Grace, I came because I wanted to see you, because your company makes my days better, because somewhere in these past weeks you have become important to me. Grace's heart began to beat faster. She turned to face him fully, searching his eyes. Important how? In the way that makes a man start thinking about the future instead of just getting through each day, Tobias said quietly. In the way that makes him hope he might be important to you too. You are, Grace whispered. I did not expect it, did not think I could feel anything through the grief, but somehow you slipped past my defenses. You have become dear to me, Tobias. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, and Grace leaned into the touch, starved for gentle contact after weeks of isolation. I know this is fast, Tobias said. I know you are still in mourning, and I will not rush you or push for anything you are not ready to give. But I want you to know that I care for you, Grace Donovan, more than I have cared for anyone in a very long time. I care for you too, Grace admitted, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. It scares me a little how much. It scares me too, Tobias said with a soft huff of laughter. I did not plan on this, did not think I would ever feel this way about anyone. They stood close together in the golden light, the leaves rustling around them like applause, and Grace felt something shift and settle in her heart. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had made room for something else now. Hope. Possibility. The tentative beginnings of love. Tobias did not kiss her that day in the aspen grove, though Grace saw the desire to do so in his eyes. Instead, he took her hand and held it gently, and they walked together through the golden trees, talking about everything and nothing, building something fragile and precious between them. The courtship that followed was slow and sweet, conducted under the watchful eyes of Belmont society. Tobias was scrupulous about Grace's reputation, always visiting her with Mrs. Henderson present or meeting her in public places where they could be seen. But within the bounds of propriety, they grew closer with each passing day. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, about the farm his family lost during the war, about drifting west afterward with no real plan except to keep moving. She told him about her father's dreams of striking it rich in the mines, about her brother's wild streak that eventually got him killed, about her mother's quiet strength that held their family together through every hardship. They discovered shared loves, books and horses, and the stark beauty of the Colorado mountains. They found that they could talk for hours without running out of things to say, or sit in comfortable silence without needing to fill the space with words. They learned each other's sorrows and joys, fears and dreams, until it felt as though they had known each other for years instead of months. 3 months after that day in the Aspens, Tobias invited Grace to have dinner with him at the hotel, the nicest restaurant in Belmont. She wore her best dress, dark gray since she was still in half-mourning, and Tobias wore a new shirt he had clearly purchased just for the occasion. They sat at a corner table as the autumn rain drummed against the windows, and halfway through the meal Tobias set down his fork and reached across the table to take her hand. Grace, I know this is sooner than most courtships, and I know you might need more time. But I cannot keep this inside anymore. I love you. I have loved you probably since that night in the cemetery when you trusted me enough to share your grief. You have become the center of my world, the thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing on my mind before I sleep. I want to build a life with you if you will have me. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears this time. I love you too, Tobias. I did not think I could feel this way again after losing everyone I cared about. I thought my heart was too broken, but you have helped me heal. You have shown me that love is not something to fear losing, but something to cherish while we have it. Is that a yes? Tobias asked, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. That is absolutely a yes, Grace said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I want to build a life with you. Yes to all of it. Tobias came around the table and pulled her to her feet, and there in the restaurant with other diners watching and smiling, he kissed her for the first time. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise, and Grace felt as though she was being remade, transformed from a woman drowning in grief into someone who could embrace joy again. They married 6 weeks later on a cold December day, in the same small church where Grace's mother's funeral had been held. It felt right somehow to claim a moment of joy in a place that had held so much sorrow. Mrs. Henderson stood as Grace's witness, and the ranch foreman from the Double R stood for Tobias. Grace wore a dress she had sewn herself, pale ivory since she was still technically in mourning, with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. The ceremony was simple and brief, but when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and Tobias kissed her, Grace felt the last pieces of her shattered world click back into place. She was no longer alone. She belonged to someone, and someone belonged to her. She had family again, chosen rather than born, but no less real for that. They took a room at the hotel for their wedding night, a luxury they could barely afford but deemed necessary. Tobias was patient and gentle, careful with Grace's inexperience, and what passed between them was tender and profound, a physical sealing of the emotional bond they had been building for months. Afterward, lying in Tobias's arms in the darkness, Grace whispered, "I wish my mother could have known you. She would have loved you." "I wish I could have known her better," Tobias said, his hand stroking her hair, "but I like to think she knows somehow. That she is at peace knowing you are cared for." "You really believe that?" "I do not know what I believe about what comes after," Tobias admitted. "But I believe that love does not end just because someone dies. The love your mother had for you still exists, Grace. It lives in you and how she shaped you, in the memories you carry. In that way, she is not truly gone." Grace curled closer to him, feeling safe and cherished and profoundly grateful for this man who had stood beside her through her darkest hour and stayed to help her find the light again. They moved into a small house on the outskirts of Belmont that the ranch owner agreed to rent them at a reduced rate. It was modest, just 3 rooms, but it was theirs, and Grace set about making it a home. She hung curtains she sewed herself, arranged the jasmine plant Tobias had given her in the front window, and slowly acquired the small necessities of domestic life. Tobias continued his work at the Double R, leaving before dawn and returning at dusk, exhausted but content. Grace kept sewing for Mrs. Henderson, saving every penny she could toward her dream of a dress shop. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire, Tobias reading aloud while Grace sewed, or simply talking about their days, building the foundation of their shared life one quiet moment at a time. The first winter of their marriage was hard. Money was tight, and the cold was bitter, and there were days when Grace wondered if they would make it through. But they kept each other warm in body and spirit and found joy in small things. A successful hunt that filled their larder with venison. The first snow of the season transforming the world into something magical. The discovery that they both loved to sing and could harmonize together beautifully. Spring came eventually, as it always did, and with it new hope. Grace learned she was pregnant in April, and the news filled them both with excitement tinged with fear. They had so little to offer a child, but they had love in abundance, and they promised each other that would be enough. Tobias took on extra work, hiring himself out to help other ranchers when his regular duties were done, pushing himself to the point of exhaustion to save money for the baby's arrival. Grace sewed tiny clothes from fabric scraps and accepted hand-me-down items from Mrs. Henderson's daughter who had children of her own. They prepared the second bedroom of their little house, painting the walls with whitewash and building a simple cradle from pine boards. In the quiet evenings, Tobias would rest his hand on Grace's growing belly and talk to the child, telling stories about the wide world waiting outside, about horses and mountains and all the good things life could offer. Grace would watch him with a heart so full it felt like it might burst, marveling at how this gentle man had entered her life at her lowest point and lifted her to heights she had never imagined. The baby came in November, a year and 3 months after Grace had knelt weeping at her mother's grave. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Grace feared she might not survive it, but Tobias stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. And finally, as the sun rose on a cold morning, their son was born. They named him Samuel after Tobias's father, and he was perfect, red-faced and squalling and utterly beautiful. Tobias held him with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, and whispered, "Hello, Samuel Miller. We have been waiting for you." Grace watched her husband cradle their newborn son and thought about how far they had both come. From lonely, grieving people who had lost everything, they had found each other and built something new, something strong and true and worth all the hardship it had taken to reach this moment. Recovery from the birth was slow, and Grace was grateful for Tobias's steady presence. He took time away from the ranch to care for her and Samuel, changing diapers and walking the floor with a crying baby at 2 in the morning and never complaining. He sang lullabies in his rough voice and rocked their son with infinite patience, and Grace fell even more deeply in love with him watching him become a father. As winter set in again, they settled into the rhythms of life with an infant. Sleep became a precious commodity, snatched in brief increments between feedings. Grace learned to sew while nursing, becoming adept at working one-handed. Tobias learned to function on very little rest, stumbling out to the ranch each morning but always coming home in the evening with energy somehow reserved for his little family. Money remained tight, tighter now with another mouth to feed, but they managed. Grace took in more sewing work that she could do at home while caring for Samuel. Tobias continued taking odd jobs whenever he could. They ate simply, patched clothes until they could be patched no more, and made do with what they had. But they were happy, genuinely happy, in a way that had nothing to do with material comfort and everything to do with love. When Samuel was 6 months old, Grace received an unexpected visitor. A woman from Denver, well-dressed and clearly wealthy, came to the house asking for Grace by name. She had heard about Grace's sewing skills from a friend who had visited Belmont and wanted to commission a wardrobe for her daughter's wedding. Grace was stunned. This was the kind of opportunity she had dreamed about but never truly believed would come. The woman offered more money than Grace usually made in 3 months, and though Grace's hands shook as she took the woman's measurements and discussed designs, she managed to project confidence and professionalism. She worked on that commission with more care than she had ever given any project, staying up late after Samuel was asleep, making sure every stitch was perfect, every seam exact. Tobias supported her completely, taking over more of the baby care in the evenings so she could work, never complaining about the disruption to their routine. When the dresses were finished, the woman from Denver was delighted. She paid Grace the agreed amount plus a generous bonus, and better still, she promised to recommend Grace's services to her friends. True to her word, within a month Grace had 2 more commissions from wealthy women in Denver, and suddenly the dream of a dress shop seemed less like fantasy and more like genuine possibility. Over the next year, Grace's reputation grew. Word spread among the wealthy families of Colorado that there was a brilliant seamstress in Belmont who could create fashions equal to anything from New York or Paris at a fraction of the cost. Orders came in steadily, and Grace saved every penny she could, building toward her goal. Tobias continued his work at the ranch, but could see that Grace's income was beginning to surpass his own. Some men might have felt threatened or diminished by that, but Tobias only felt proud. He encouraged her at every turn, believed in her talent, and made it possible for her to work by caring for Samuel during his off hours. When Samuel was 2 years old, Grace finally had enough money saved to lease a small shop space on Belmont's Main Street. Tobias helped her fix up the space, building shelving and display areas, painting the walls a cheerful yellow that made the room feel welcoming. Grace had a sign made, Grace's fine dressmaking, and when they hung it above the door, she burst into tears. "My mother would have been so proud," she said, leaning into Tobias's embrace. "She is proud," Tobias assured her. "Wherever she is, I know she is proud. I certainly am." The dress shop was a success from the day it opened. Grace's existing clients continued to order from her, and new customers came from Belmont and the surrounding towns. She hired 2 young women to help with basic sewing, and slowly, her business grew into something stable and profitable. Tobias left the ranch to work in the shop, handling the business aspects that Grace had no head for, managing supplies and accounts, and dealing with suppliers. They were partners in every sense of the word, supporting and strengthening each other, building a life that exceeded anything either had imagined during that long night they spent at Sarah Donovan's grave. When Samuel was 4, Grace became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she was no longer half-starved and working herself to exhaustion. Their daughter arrived in the spring, a healthy, loud baby girl they named Sarah after Grace's mother. Holding her daughter for the first time, Grace felt the circle complete in a way. Her mother was gone, but her mother's name would live on. The love and strength Sarah Donovan had instilled in her daughter would be passed to the next generation. The years rolled on, bringing the usual mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. The dress shop continued to thrive, eventually expanding to the space next door. Tobias proved to have a sharp head for business, and under his management their finances stabilized and then flourished. They bought the house they had been renting, then eventually built a larger one on the edge of town, with room for their growing family and Grace's aging jasmine plant that still bloomed faithfully each year. Samuel grew into a bright, curious boy who loved horses like his father and had his mother's eye for beauty and detail. Sarah was fierce and determined from birth, tackling life with a boldness that both terrified and delighted her parents. They were good children, though not perfect, and the house was filled with laughter and occasional tears, with the noise and chaos and profound joy of family life. Grace and Tobias weathered the storms together. A hard winter that killed half the cattle in the region and tested every business in town. A bout of influenza that swept through Belmont and briefly threatened young Sarah's life. The usual disagreements and frustrations that arose in any marriage, worked through with patience and commitment to each other. But through it all, they held fast to the foundation they had built that night in the cemetery, when a grieving woman and a kind cowboy had stood together until sunrise. They had learned then that love was not just joy and passion, but also presence and patience, the willingness to stand beside someone through darkness, trusting that light would come again. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Tobias surprised Grace with a trip back to the Aspen Grove where he had first told her he loved her. They left the children with Mrs. Henderson, who had become like a grandmother to Samuel and Sarah, and rode out into the mountains on a golden September day. The aspens were turning again, just as brilliant as Grace remembered from that first time. They walked hand in hand through the trees, older now and carrying the weight of a decade of shared life, but still in love, perhaps even more deeply than before. "Do you remember standing here and telling me I had become important to you?" Grace asked, leaning against the same tree where they had stood 10 years earlier. "I remember every moment of that day," Tobias said. "I remember how scared I was that you would tell me it was too soon, that I was overstepping. I remember thinking that I did not deserve to feel happy again so quickly after losing my mother," Grace admitted. "But you taught me that grief and joy can exist together, that loving again does not mean forgetting those we have lost." "Your mother would want you to be happy," Tobias said, as he had said many times over the years. "Just as my brother would want me to build a good life. The best way to honor those we have lost is to live fully, to love deeply, to make our time here matter." Grace turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "You have given me everything I never knew I needed: a partner, a family, a home, a purpose. But more than that, you have given me yourself, your steady, patient, endlessly kind self. I love you more today than I did the day we married, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." "And I love you," Tobias said, his voice thick with emotion. "You took a lonely drifter and gave him a reason to put down roots. You gave me children to raise and a life worth living. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace Miller." They kissed there among the golden aspens, a kiss that held a decade of shared memories, of struggles overcome and joys multiplied, of two people who had found each other in the darkest moment and chosen to walk together toward the light. The years continued to pass with the relentless march of time. The children grew, Samuel eventually working alongside his father in the dress shop's business operations while studying accounting, showing no interest in ranching despite Tobias's efforts to interest him in horses. Sarah developed her mother's talent for sewing and design, her quick fingers and bold creative vision taking Grace's work to new heights. Together, mother and daughter created dresses that were sought after throughout Colorado and beyond. Grace watched her daughter's talent bloom with pride and a bittersweet ache, wishing her own mother could have seen this, could have known these grandchildren who carried forward the family's gifts. But she told Sarah stories about the grandmother she had never met, keeping Sarah Donovan's memory alive through words and the values she had instilled in Grace. When Samuel was 18, he fell in love with the doctor's daughter, a sensible girl named Margaret with a quick laugh and a kind heart. They married in a ceremony that filled Grace with both joy and the strange melancholy of watching your child step into their own adult life. Tobias held her hand throughout the wedding, understanding without words the complicated emotions that came with this transition. 2 years later, Sarah announced she was in love with a traveling photographer who had come to Belmont to document the changing West. Grace's initial skepticism about the young man melted when she saw how he looked at Sarah, with the same mixture of awe and devotion that Tobias had always shown Grace. They married and planned to travel together, Sarah designing clothes inspired by the places they visited, while her husband captured images of a rapidly modernizing frontier. And so the house that had once rung with children's laughter grew quiet again, leaving Grace and Tobias alone together as they had been at the start. They were in their late 40s now, gray threading through their hair, lines marking their faces, bodies carrying the aches and pains of hard-lived lives. But they were still strong, still active, still deeply connected. They continued running the dress shop together, though with less intensity now that both children had moved on. They took time to travel a bit themselves, visiting Denver and once even taking the train all the way to San Francisco, marveling at the ocean and the bustling city so different from their mountain town. But they always came back to Belmont, to the home they had built together, to the life they had carved out of grief and loneliness and determination. This was where they belonged, among the mountains and the memories, in the place where their love had first taken root. On the 20th anniversary of the night they met, Grace asked Tobias to take her back to the cemetery. It was late August again, the same time of year, and the evening air carried the same quality of light filtering through approaching dusk. They stood together at Sarah Donovan's grave, the wooden marker long since replaced with a proper headstone that Tobias had commissioned once they had the money. Grace laid flowers on the grave, as she did several times each year, and was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you, Mama," she finally said softly, "for raising me to be strong, for teaching me to sew, for showing me what love looks like. I hope I have made you proud. I hope you would be happy with the life I have built." Tobias put his arm around Grace's shoulders, and she leaned into him, comfortable and familiar after 2 decades together. They watched the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in the same shades of gold and crimson that had colored that first night, and Grace felt profound gratitude for the strange and beautiful path her life had taken. She had lost so much that year when she was 21, kneeling alone and weeping in the summer dusk. She had thought grief might destroy her, that she would never feel whole again. But a cowboy with a kind heart had stood beside her through that endless night, and in doing so had shown her that healing was possible, that joy could bloom again even in soil that had known profound sorrow. "What are you thinking?" Tobias asked quietly. "I am thinking about beginnings," Grace said, "about how the worst night of my life led to the best thing that ever happened to me, about how you appeared exactly when I needed you most." "I think perhaps we appeared when we both needed someone," Tobias said. "I was drifting, Grace. Going through the motions but not really living. You gave me purpose, a reason to build instead of just survive. We saved each other then." "Yes," Tobias agreed. "I think we did." They stood together until the stars emerged, just as they had 20 years ago, and then walked hand in hand out of the cemetery and back toward town, toward home, toward the rest of their lives together. More years passed, bringing grandchildren, 5 in total from Samuel and 3 from Sarah. The house filled with visiting children and chaos during holidays, and Grace and Tobias embraced their roles as grandparents with enthusiasm. They were the kind of grandparents who slipped candy to the children when their parents were not looking, who told elaborate stories and played games on the floor despite creaking knees, who loved without reservation and spoiled without shame. Grace taught her granddaughters to sew, passing on skills that stretched back generations. Tobias taught his grandsons to ride and showed them how to treat horses with respect and patience. Together, they gave the grandchildren the gift of feeling cherished, of knowing they were part of a family story that stretched back into history and forward into the future. The dress shop eventually passed to Sarah, who ran it with her artistic vision while her husband's photography business operated from the same building. Samuel became a successful accountant in Denver, but he visited frequently, always making sure his parents knew they were loved and appreciated. As Grace and Tobias moved into their 60s, they gradually stepped back from work and focused on enjoying the time they had remaining. They had built something lasting, something that would continue after they were gone, and there was deep satisfaction in that knowledge. They took walks together every evening, weather permitting, often ending up at the cemetery to visit Sarah Donovan's grave. It had become a habit, a pilgrimage of sorts, returning to the place where their story began. Grace no longer wept there, Instead, she talked to her mother, sharing news of the grandchildren and the business, of the life that had grown from the seeds planted in grief. "I think she knows," Tobias said one evening as they walked away from the grave toward home. "I think she has always known how things turned out." "I hope so," Grace said. "I hope she knows that her death, as terrible as it was, led to something beautiful, that you came into my life because of it." "Everything that matters to me stems from that night," Tobias said quietly. "You, our children, our grandchildren, the home we built. All of it traces back to choosing to stay with a grieving stranger until sunrise." Grace stopped walking and turned to face her husband, this man who had stood beside her for nearly 30 years, who had been her rock and her comfort, her partner and her great love. "Promise me something." "Anything? When my time comes, do not grieve alone the way I did. Let our children be with you. Let yourself feel the sadness but also remember the joy. Promise me you will keep living fully the way you taught me to do." Tobias's eyes shone with tears. "I promise." "But only if you promise me the same." "I promise," Grace said, and they sealed it with a kiss, there on the dusty road leading home as the sunset painted the mountains in fire. They had many good years yet ahead of them. Years of watching grandchildren grow, of celebrating anniversaries and birthdays, of quiet evenings by the fire and summer picnics by the creek. Years of holding hands and stealing kisses, of inside jokes and comfortable silences, of the deep contentment that comes from a life well lived with someone who knows you completely and loves you anyway. When Tobias passed away at 72, peacefully in his sleep after a good day spent with family, Grace grieved, but she did not break. She had learned, in the decades since her mother's death, that grief was the price of love, and it was a price she would pay gladly 1,000 times over for the privilege of loving Tobias Miller. She let her children comfort her, accepted the community's sympathy, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of her loss without letting it destroy her. And she remembered that night in the cemetery when Tobias had stood beside her, teaching her through his presence that surviving grief meant acknowledging it, sitting with it, and eventually carrying it forward into continued living. Grace lived another 8 years without him, years that were harder and lonelier but still filled with purpose. She watched more grandchildren be born, great-grandchildren now, carrying the family forward. She kept the jasmine plant alive, though it was ancient and gnarled now, still producing its delicate white flowers each year like a promise kept. When her time finally came at 80 years old, Grace died surrounded by her children and grandchildren, in the house she and Tobias had built, holding a photograph of her husband taken on their 50th anniversary. Her last words were, "Tell him I am coming. Tell him to wait for me." They buried her next to Tobias in the Belmont Cemetery, not far from her mother's grave. 3 generations of family attended the funeral, along with much of the town, all coming to pay respects to a woman who had built something meaningful from loss, who had turned grief into purpose and love. Sarah, now in her 50s and gray herself, stood at her mother's grave as the sun set, and she felt the weight of the family story settling on her shoulders. The story of a young woman weeping alone and a cowboy who chose kindness. The story of love blooming in the ashes of sorrow. The story of a family built on the foundation of 2 lonely people finding each other at exactly the right moment. She placed flowers on both her parents' graves, white jasmine blossoms from the ancient plant that still grew in the house, and she whispered, "Thank you for showing us what love looks like, for building something that will last beyond your years, for choosing each other and choosing to keep choosing each other every day." And as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Sarah walked out of the cemetery toward where her own husband waited, ready to continue the family tradition of standing beside each other through darkness and light, grief and joy. All the complicated, beautiful, messy reality of a life shared with someone you love. The story that began with tears at a graveside had grown into something larger than one night or one couple. It had become a legacy, passed down through generations, a testament to the truth that love can find us even in our darkest moments, and that choosing to stand beside someone until sunrise can change the entire course of a life. In the end, Grace and Tobias's story was not really about grief at all, though that is where it started. It was about hope, about kindness, about two people who had lost everything finding each other and building something that would outlast them both. It was about the truth that love is not just something that happens to us, but something we choose every day in 1,000 small ways. And it was about sunrise, that daily promise that no matter how dark the night, light will come again, and we can choose to greet it with someone beside us, someone who will stand with us through whatever comes, until our own sun finally sets and we rest together in the good earth, our story complete and our love echoing forward through all the lives we touched along the way.